Royal weddings are usually a spectacle of tiaras, trumpets, and tradition on full display, but one royal marriage broke every rule. 80 years ago, far from palace gates and public adoration, King Edward VIII wed Wallis Simpson in a quiet, uneasy ceremony in France. No fanfare, no family, and no crown. The wedding came just weeks after the coronation of Edward's brother, George VI, a coronation made possible because Edward had abdicated to marry the woman he loved. Wallis's divorce had only just been finalised. The ink was barely dry. They married at the Château de Condé, a lavish French estate that couldn't hide the awkwardness of the day. Wallis wore a fitted gown in icy blue-grey, sleek, stylish, but yet unroyal. Edward chose a civilian suit, not a single uniform or royal insignia in sight. In their wedding photos, the couple looked stiff, distant. Royal photographer Cecil Beaton later said Edward's eyes held an essentially sad look. He'd given up everything and didn't seem entirely sure why. And according to royal author Jane Marguerite Tippett, neither bride nor groom looked back on the day with joy. It was a royal wedding like no other, stripped of splendour, overshadowed by sacrifice, and remembered less for love than for loss. Before we get started, if you want to support the channel and find all my links in one place, just scan the QR code on screen. And why not join my Patreon? It's completely free for a 7-day trial, and you can grab my Tudor colouring book as a thank you of my appreciation. And don't worry if you missed the code now, I'll show it again at the end of the video. So thanks for your support. Now, let's get into this week's story. Wallis Simpson later admitted that the wedding preparations were not very gay, and it's no wonder. The ceremony stood in stark contrast to every royal wedding that had come before it. No palace, no procession, and no family in attendance, just a small, awkward gathering inside a French chateau. Among the few guests, Edward's loyal best man, Major Fruity Metcalf, his chauffeur, his equerry, and in a strange twist, businessman Herman Rogers, a man Wallis had once hoped to marry before Edward upended her life. The ceremony itself was borderline scandalous. Reverend J.A. Jardine agreed to officiate, defying the Church of England's strict rules about marrying divorced people with living spouses. He was punished for it, defrocked, and later opened a garish tourist trap in Hollywood, which he called the Windsor Cathedral. But even as Edward tried to make the day feel official, the sting of rejection was everywhere. King George VI had refused to grant Wallis the title of Her Royal Highness. Edward, humiliated, called it a nice wedding present. And when Queen Mary sent no gift at all, he wrote to her, "I am bitterly hurt and disappointed that you virtually ignored the most important event in my life." He had given up the throne for love, but on that wedding day in France it was clear the cost of that choice still followed them. Even the gifts were loaded with meaning. A Fabergé box arrived from Prince George, Duke of Kent, Edward's younger brother, but Edward rejected it. Why accept a token, he reasoned, from someone who had never once stood against the family's cold indifference? The wedding venue itself, the Château de Condé, belonged to millionaire Charles Bedaux, a man so eccentric and politically suspect that both British and French intelligence services kept a wary eye on him. Still, the chateau had its charms. A $40,000 pipe organ, a $15,000 telephone system, and all the opulence money could buy, except for love or legitimacy. On the day, Wallis wore her now iconic pale blue gown, paired with long silver gloves in matching fabric and a tilted straw hat. Her jewellery glittered sapphires and diamonds around her neck and on her wrist and in her ears, a royal bride in everything but name. A second divorce from Ernest Simpson had only been finalised the month before. The timing was tight, the public mood was tense, and the family, well, they stayed silent. Edward had hoped to have a royal chaplain officiate at the event to lend it a thread of official dignity, but King George quickly crushed that idea. Even Edward's backup, the Reverend Martin Andrews of the Duchy of Cornwall, was blocked. He finally found Reverend J.A. Jardine, who defied the Church of England to marry them and was subsequently defrocked. Everything about the day was improvised, isolated and fragile, and behind the fashion, the jewels and the chateau walls, it felt more like exile and celebration. In the end, Edward had little choice. With every official channel blocked by the Crown, he turned to Reverend J.A. Jardine, a man described by his biographer, Philip Ziegler, as turbulent. Even Edward knew it was a gamble. Jardine had no royal sanction, nor was it formally blessed, but he was willing. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, the same man who had helped force Edward from the throne, was appalled. He called Jardine a seeker of notoriety and wondered aloud how Edward, once King of England, could have lost his dignity to the point of asking a man of this sort to marry him. It was more than a breach of etiquette, it was defiance. The Church of England until 2002 would not permit the marriage of royalty to a divorced person with a living former spouse. Jardine's act was seen as near sacrilegious. At first, Edward believed he had chosen wisely, but that illusion didn't last. Soon after the wedding, Jardine toured the United States, gleefully spilling details about the ceremony to anyone who would listen. So much for discretion. The altar itself, according to Ziegler, was no sacred monument, just a bogus Renaissance chest, a stage set for a dethroned king. Cecil Beaton took the official photographs. Behind the lens, he studied Edward's face. Later, he wrote in his diary that the Duke's eyes were essentially sad, tragic eyes belied by an impertinent tilt of the nose. It was all there, the weight of sacrifice, the sting of exile, and a flicker of pride that refused to bow, even as everything else had. Cecil Beaton saw everything the photographs didn't show. He described the former king's hands as common, like a mechanic's, weathered and rough, with a disfigured thumbnail. It was a small, almost pitiful detail, but one that spoke volumes about how far Edward had fallen from majesty. Beaton also spoke at length with Wallis. He found her commanding a strong force, he said, intelligent within her vast limitations. She talked about the Duke with fierce devotion, convinced he was one of the greatest brains of our time. She praised his character, his energy, and she was determined to love him, though Beaton quietly suspected she was never truly in love. The guest list, already sparse, became stranger the closer you looked. Alongside Edward's best man, the chauffeur and equerry, sat his hairdresser, Charles Topper. Wallis's aunt, Mrs. Buchanan Merriman, was there too. The service itself was split into two parts. First, a French civil ceremony, and then 10 minutes later, an Anglican ritual officiated by the ever-controversial Reverend Jardine. In both, Wallis vowed to obey her husband, a traditional promise in a marriage that was anything but. And then came a moment that still stings in hindsight. There was no kiss, not in the civil service, not in the Anglican one, just silence. Edward placed the ring on her finger, his eyes full of tears, and that was it. No kiss, no cheer, and no joy. Only the weight of what had been given up, and what could never be regained. Despite the scandal and backlash, a wave of sympathy remained. After the wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor received more than 3,000 telegrams and 30,000 letters from well-wishers worldwide. In a rare public statement, Edward said, "The Duchess and I would like to thank all those who have so kindly sent us presents and good wishes. We shall never forget their friendly messages, which mean so much to us on this day." They eventually settled in France in a grand estate on the edge of Paris, a mansion they called Villa Windsor. There, they slipped into a life of privilege and luxury. Lavish parties in Paris, social seasons in New York and sun-drenched holidays with the rich and well-connected. Wallis had no crown, no title of Her Royal Highness, but she had the lifestyle of a queen, at least on the surface. Still, it all came at a cost. When the Duke died in 1972 at the age of 77, the glamour began to fade. Wallis, for all her jewels and socialite polish, was left utterly alone. She had been worshipped, adored, elevated, and now she was adrift. In a rare act of royal grace, Queen Elizabeth II welcomed her to Buckingham Palace for the Duke's funeral. It was one of the few personal gestures extended in decades. The Queen had seen her husband one final time in Paris during a quiet visit with Prince Philip just before Edward's death, and for a brief moment the monarchy and the woman who once shook its foundation stood under the same roof, no longer rivals, just two widows bound by the same man and very different memories. It was a rare gesture and a telling one. The Queen's decision to receive Wallis at Buckingham Palace after Edward's death signalled something larger, a willingness to put personal differences aside in service of dignity, tradition, and the greater good. More than a decade later, when Wallis died in 1986, that same spirit remained. Her funeral was held at St George's Chapel in Windsor, the resting place of kings and queens. Senior royals in attendance were the Queen, Prince Philip, and the Queen Mother. It was a public act of respect, but the distance lingered nonetheless. Her name was never spoken during the service, and it lasted less than half an hour. There was no grand procession, no formal eulogies. Unlike Wallis's wedding all those years earlier, it was stripped of the ceremonial weight that usually surrounds a royal life or death. Wallis Simpson, the woman who shook the monarchy to its core, was laid to rest beside the man who gave up everything for her, and in the end, she departed much as she had arrived, watched, judged, but never quite embraced. If you missed the opportunity at the start of this video, here's your second chance. If you'd like to support the channel and find all my links, just scan the QR code on screen. Join Patreon for free for a 7-day trial, and you can grab my Tudor colouring book as a thank you of my appreciation. Every bit of support helps me keep making videos like this. Even a thumbs up or a comment on the video increases its chances of being seen by more people. So I really appreciate you being here, and thanks for watching.